This is the key for lesson 2.2 on absolute value. Your homework was to do this. It's like a little sheet of paper in your packet. 1 through 16 is on the front, and then 17 and 18 is on the back of it. So the first part here, it says you could draw a number line to help you. I don't know if you need a number line, but the absolute value of -7 would be 7. Remember, absolute value is asking how far is this number away from 0. Even though it's -7, it's still 7 away from 0. The absolute value of -3 is 3. The absolute value of 8 is 8. Notice your number for absolute value. These numbers out here are always positive, so it really doesn't matter. You just kind of ignore the sign inside those absolute value bars. Continuing on, write the absolute value of each number. The absolute value of -9, I just see the number 9. Absolute value of -2, 2. Absolute value of 100, 100. Absolute value of -299 is just 299. So you're just kind of looking at the number 802. 341 is what you should be writing. Even though it's negative, that's just how far it is from 0. To complete each inequality, I think it's important that you write the numbers first outside. So what do I mean by writing the numbers first? If you look at the absolute value of -18 and -24, you want to look at the numbers. So you would almost want to write this is 18 and this is 24. Now look at those numbers. 18 is less than 24. Going here, if you did the absolute value of -30 and -40, I'm looking at those numbers and I see 30 and I see 40. So 30 is less than 40. And then you have 100 and then -200. But if you look at the absolute value, 100 would be less than 200. If you look at just the numbers, 280 would be greater than 190. So absolute value is just taking the number out of the absolute value bar and thinking how far away is this number from 0. 650, if I just look at the number, is greater than 480. So I'd like to answer these. Absolute value of 570 is greater than 400. So I think writing those numbers in there is helpful. This one's kind of a neat question. Two numbers have an absolute value of 37. What two numbers would those be? Those would be -37 and +37. Those both have an absolute value of 37. They are both 37 away from 0. But the question is, which of the two numbers is further from 1 on the number line? Well, this 37 would be 36 away from 1, because 1 would be placed here on a number line if this was 0. And then -37 would be 37 just to get to 0 plus 1 more. So it would actually be 38 away from 1. So -37 is your answer. It is further away from 1 than +37. I'm going to flip and go to the back. This example is talking about people having money in their bank account. Keith has a -190 in his account. Aisha has 80 in her savings account, and Sonia has -250. So who has the most money in their savings account? Aisha is the only person that's positive, so she has the most money. Who has the least amount of money? Well, Keith and Sonia are both in the negatives. Who's further in the negatives? Sonia, so she has the least amount in her account. This one here is kind of like the one we did in our notes. You need to draw a picture to go along with this. So this was part of your assignment, was to show me your picture for number 18. It tells you where the helicopter's flying at, so many feet above sea level, the flock of birds 80 meters below the helicopter, the submarine, which is below sea level, the group of divers that are 162 meters above the submarine. So if you're going to draw this picture, it's going to look something like this. You've got your 0 meters, the helicopter was 155 above that, and then the flock of birds was 80 meters below 155. So if you take 155 and subtract 80, that's where you get 75. So the flock of birds is at 75 meters above sea level, or 80 meters difference between 155 and it. Then they gave you the submarine being 185 below 0. That's where it's the -185. And then if you come up 162 from that, you would be at 23 meters. How do you figure out this number here? Well, you kind of take the absolute value of -185, which is just a +185. If you subtract the 162 to figure out what this difference is between these numbers, you get 23 meters. But you got to remember that's below sea level. So your 23 meters is actually a -23 meters below sea level. So it's 23 from here, and then it's 162 between this number and this number. And so you can kind of use that by labeling what your picture should look like to help you with questions on 18. So back to 18. What is the vertical distance between the helicopter and the submarine? The helicopter was 155 above sea level, and the submarine was 185 below. So you'd have to add those two together for a total of 340 meters. Why does that work? You're taking their absolute value. This one was 155 just to get to here. And then if you remember, the submarine is 185 just to get to here. So you would have to add these two things together. And that's where you get the grand total of 340 meters. How far below sea level are the divers? We actually figured that out. We took the absolute value of 185 and we subtracted the 162 to find out they were 23 meters below sea level. You either say it like this, or you would have to put the negative 23 meters to show that it's below sea level. How far above the divers is the flock of birds? Well, the 155 minus 80, that's how we got the 75 meters. So if I look back here, the 155 was the helicopter. We subtracted the 80 to figure out that the flock of birds were at 75 meters, meaning that's how far they are above sea level here. So if I look here, that they're at 75 meters, but they want to know how far above the divers is the flock of birds. So we knew that the birds were 75 meters above zero, but the divers were 23 below that. So you would have to add the 23 plus the 75 to get the 98 meters. And let me show you that visual so you can get that visual. The flock of birds is 75 meters just to get from here to zero, and then the divers is another 23. So you'd have to add these two together to figure out that total distance. That's how you get 98 meters. Which is closer to sea level, the divers or the flock of birds, and by how much? The divers were at 75 above, and the birds were 75 above, the divers were 23 below. So you're trying to figure out like who's closer to sea level. Well, the divers are 23 away from sea level, so they're closer. By how many meters? Well, you'd have to figure out the difference between 75 and 23. So it's like taking the absolute value of that negative 23. If you take 75 and subtract 23, the divers are 52 meters closer to zero than the birds are. And how does that work in this picture? Well, the divers are only 23 from zero. The birds are 75 from zero. So how much closer is this than this one? So that's where I would take the 75 meters and subtract the 23 to figure out what is that difference. Like how much closer are they here? Which is closer to the divers, the helicopter or the submarine, and by how many meters? So you got to look at the divers and figure out the helicopter to the divers was at 155 above sea level, and the divers are 23 below sea level. So you almost have to add these two together to figure out that total distance is 178 meters. And then the submarine was at 178 below sea level, and if you subtract the 162, then there are 16 meters is the difference. So which is closer to the divers, the helicopter, or the submarine? The helicopter up here is 155 just to get back to zero, plus the 23. And that's where I said that they were 178 meters away. And then the submarine was only from the divers was only 162 away. We already knew that. So the submarine is closer. How much closer? If you take the 178 that you got for your answer from the helicopter to the divers and subtract the difference between the submarine and the divers, it's only 16 meters different. So the submarine is closer to the divers by 16 meters than the helicopter is to the divers. Order the helicopter, the birds, the divers, and the submarine from closest to sea level to the furthest. So which one's closest? The divers, they're at negative 23, but the absolute value would just be 23. The birds are at 75, so they're 75 away. The helicopter is at 155 away, and the submarine is at 185 away. So that would be your order from closest to furthest.